Our second speaker, Fuad Kavur, was also born in Istanbul and came to London in the early 60s when his uncle was the Turkish ambassador here. After studying at University College London, he worked with John Copley at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, and later with Sir Peter Ustinov at the Scala, the Mozarteum Salzburg, and at the Hamburg, Paris, and Berlin opera houses. He went on to stage the English version of Wagner's Ring at the Seattle Opera. He was the producer of the film Mehmet My Hawk, İnce Mehmet, based on the Turkish classic by Yaşar Kemal. Fuad was also executive producer for the TV documentary ATATURK, directed by Tolga Örnek. He has now written the screenplay for a feature film on ATATURK to be shot in Hungary in 2011. The film will be produced by Fuad Kavur and Branko Lustig, the Oscar-winning producer of, amongst others, Schindler's List.
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen.
There is a saying in the theater, a hard act to follow. And this is exactly the situation I find myself in at this precise moment, namely, having to talk about ATATURK right after Dr. Andrew Mango, the world authority on the subject. Be it as it may, I would like to thank the ATATURK Society of UK for giving me this honor and allowing me to address their distinguished guests in this most prestigious seat of learning, SOAS. Professor Sir Martin Gilbert, the eminent English historian, wrote, "In the history of the righteousness, there are many little-known stories. One of them is the willingness of the Turkish government of Kemal Atatürk to take in German and Austrian Jews and use their talents of these victims of race prejudice and persecution to the benefit of the Turkish Republic in its academic, scientific, and medical endeavors." The story I'm about to tell is a small segment of this larger picture. The German composer Paul Hindemith was one of the giants of the 20th century classical music. He belonged to the same group of expressionists as Arnold Schoenberg, Anton Webern, and Alban Berg. Hindemith is best known for his two operas, Matthis der Maler and Cardiac. One evening in 1951, when he had just finished conducting his symphony in B with the Berlin Philharmonic, the stage manager arrived at his dressing room and told him that there was a young man at the stage door who wanted to see him. Hindemith, with a towel around his neck, said he was too tired to see anybody. The stage manager explained he had tried to get rid of the man, but he was as stubborn as a mule. Thinking that it was probably another autograph hunter, Hindemith gave in and the visitor was allowed in. He was a man in his early 20s. Hindemith asked, "What can I do for you, young man?" And the young man answered, "I am your son." There was a long silence. Finally, clutching to his straws, Hindemith protested, "Aber ich hab kein Kinder." I have no children. The young man insisted, "Yes, you do, in Turkey. Many at the Ankara State Conservatory. I am a student of conducting, and you founded that school, so we are all your children. I just wanted to come and say thank you." Hindemith replied, "You are wrong, young man. You are all Kemal Atatürk's children. It was his vision to establish a music school in Ankara. I merely did the job." The young man in question was Hikmet Şimşek. He later became the principal conductor of the Ankara Symphony until his death in 2001. At first sight, this might seem a frivolous little anecdote, but in reality, it tells a lot. First, about Kemal Atatürk the man. Secondly, the kind of man he wanted to make of the Turk, and in particular, the young Turk. Of course, I don't mean Atatürk wanted an entire nation of Toscaninis, Bruno Walters, or Fritz Busch. However, what he wanted was a kind of Turk whose sensibilities allowed him to appreciate Beethoven's, Mozart's, or Verdi's of this world. Stanislavski, the father of method acting, wrote a book, How to Build a Character. It's about what happens when an actor looks at a character in a play. What kind of a person is he or she? How does he walk? How does he talk? Or if it's a woman, does she wear makeup? Or how does she dress? Thus, the actor lifts the character off the page and makes it a living person. And this is exactly what Atatürk wanted to do with the young Turk. He was building a character. Then, an event took place on January the 30th, 1933, which made Atatürk's task a lot easier. Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany and promptly proceeded to sack any Jews who held important posts in the country. One of these was Dr. Ernest Pretorius. In 1933, he had just been appointed the chief conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. Then Goebbels summoned him to his office and sacked him on the spot. Jobless, for 2 years, Pretorius drove a cab in Berlin. It was at that point in his life that he received an invitation from Ankara. Paul Hindemith, arriving there earlier, had recommended him to Kemal Atatürk. As soon as Pretorius got to Ankara and had his first meeting with Atatürk, he was appointed to the post of the chief conductor of the Presidential Symphony Orchestra. Years later, his obituary mentions, if the Ankara Symphony Orchestra had achieved international technical standards, it was entirely due to Ernst Pretorius, who not only was a great conductor, but also an exceptional orchestral pedagogue. Then, another event took place which played into Atatürk's hands even further. On March the 9th, 1933, stormtroopers, brown shirts, occupied the Staatsoper in Berlin and hoisted the Swastika flag on the roof. The next day, the intendant of the theater, Karl Ebert, a most eminent stage director in Europe at the time, was summoned to Hermann Göring's office. Ebert Jr. tells us the rest of the story. Referring to the events of the previous night, Göring explained, "These things happen in any revolution, don't worry about it." 2 days later, Ebert slipped through the frontier to Switzerland and made his way to England. Then, totally out of the blue, he received another cryptic message from Turkey. Would he be interested in working in an opera house in Ankara? There was, however, a slight problem. It did not exist yet. The proposal intrigued Ebert because it involved possibly creating something from scratch. The first meeting with his new employer, Kemal Atatürk, was arranged at Çankaya, the presidential residence, at 9 a.m. in the morning. Now let us allow Peter, Karl Ebert Jr., to take over. My father watched from the first floor window a car drive up the entrance. Atatürk came out. Obviously, he had had a late night. As he got out of the car, he slightly stumbled. 5 minutes later, the door swung open and Atatürk strode in, fresh and sharp as a razor. He immediately started a most detailed interview about how to form an opera company in Ankara. Ebert Jr. adds, Atatürk was always clear, decisive, and respectful. He believed in the importance of the arts for the nation's well-being. Atatürk wanted to know about Karl's experience in music theater. Karl started by mentioning he had studied with Max Reinhardt, the most eminent theater director and teacher of his times, but he was interrupted. Atatürk already knew who exactly Max Reinhardt was. Atatürk's plan was simple, honest and uncompromising. He wanted to bring every aspect of artistic, cultural, and creative life in Turkey up to the highest standards in the West. Finally, he asked, how long will it take for Turkish singers and actors to perform plays and operas? Karl replied, a minimum of 3 years for drama and 5 for opera. Atatürk retorted, 2 or 3. Karl explained, the performances could not reach the standard which I myself would demand from a Turkish national theater and opera. A ruthless realist, Atatürk had to agree without further debate, but it was obvious he was a man in a hurry. He could not wait to see the character he was trying to build, the young Turk as a true European. And having a national theater and opera was an important part of this plan. But first the Ebert family had to find a home to settle down in Ankara. Let us sneak into Gertie Ebert, Mrs. Ebert's correspondence. Ankara is not yet a city, but more of an ambition. The little old town of Ankara sits on 2 small hills, and around it they have started building the new town. They began with masses of stone houses built in a kind of colonial style with corner shops and uneven pavements. Then suddenly, the occasional enormous and ugly building sticks out. A new bank here and a ministry there. Few boulevards crisscross each other, but many smaller streets are still primitive and remain unfinished. Everybody has to wear rubber galoshes. The other day, after heavy rain, Maestro Pretorius had to pull up his trouser legs and jump like a flamingo to reach the music academy in order to conduct his weekly concert. Such was the city in which Atatürk was aiming at starting at an opera company, a national theater, and a drama academy. However, Ebert soon realized his problems were greater than envisaged. Sure, the task was exciting, but he had to remind himself at all times that Ankara was no Berlin, Hamburg, or Vienna. There had never been any attempt to create a national theater or music drama. Turkey remained an artistic desert because Islam had forbidden all performing arts, and the Ottoman Empire had followed its edicts blindfolded until the same led it to its demise. But now, Atatürk's young Turkish Republic was marching in a different direction to Europe. The curriculum left nothing to chance. Apart from the standard subjects, vocal training, music theory, role study, staging rehearsals, the students had to learn speech training, languages, movement, dancing, and fencing. Finding the right students posed another problem. Since there had never been a theater or opera culture, how could one reach out for potential performance? Karl submitted this to Atatürk in their second meeting. As ever, he came up with a snap answer. Throughout Turkey, the government would pay for a massive publicity campaign with posters, leaflets, and the works. Then he had an afterthought. How would swarms of young Turks would even find the money to travel to Ankara to audition? So he ordered the government to pay for the traveling expenses of any youngster interested to come to Ankara to do so. As ever, Atatürk was well ahead of his time, for one could say this was almost the prototype of the X Factor. Atatürk was so fascinated by the theater and opera that once the auditions started, he would often sneak into the studio, sit at the back, and to the horror of all present, whisper, "Just ignore me." One such occasion stands out. One day, a young shepherd girl from the Anatolian plain arrived to audition. Karl asked her the usual question, "What would you like to sing?" She gave the name of a song from a musical and sang it. After she finished, another routine question came. "What else have you brought?" "Nothing," was the answer. She did not know any other Western music. "How did you learn this song then?" "It was in a film I saw." "But you couldn't possibly have learned it by just hearing it once in the cinema." Then came the punchline. "I liked the film so much that I went to see it twice." By then, it was obvious that apart from her quite promising vocal material, the girl had talent. Consequently, she was asked to sing a few scales, which the répétiteur would play on the piano, just to see her vocal range. The pianist played, but nothing happened. It turned out she could not hear or connect to the chords of the singing scales because the Oriental Turkish musical scale was quite different from the Western diatonic scale. However, she was accepted, which made Atatürk very happy, because he was witnessing the birth of the European Turk. In due course, the girl became a star pupil at the academy, and Atatürk banned playing of all Oriental music on Turkish radio stations. Finally, the work started bearing fruit. The first piece performed at the studio was Mozart's one-act opera Bastien et Bastienne with a Turkish libretto. Then that was followed by the second acts only of Puccini's Madame Butterfly and Tosca. Opera was beginning to take roots in Turkey. Here, a small digression might be called for because it illustrates the fascination opera held for Atatürk. In fact, the first Turkish opera ever composed was commissioned by him. It was composed by Adnan Saygun, probably the most important Turkish classical composer, whose works still turn up in concert halls around the world. Again, Atatürk often attended the rehearsals. One day, he noticed the rehearsals were not going anywhere. There was tension between the conductor and the composer. Osman Zeki, the conductor, once a student of Debussy at the Paris Conservatoire, belonged to the French idiom, whereas Saygun's music was quite Germanic, almost Wagnerian. Finally, the tensions reached such a point that everything came to a halt. Once more, Atatürk had to step in. The conductor, Osman Zeki, none other than the composer of the Turkish national anthem, was sacked on the spot, and Adnan Saygun took over the conducting. Since he was now conducting his own piece, from that moment on, the rehearsals progressed without any further problems. Atatürk certainly did not believe in the over-optimistic saying in the theater, "It will be all right on the night," and had acted accordingly. At 2:30 on Tuesday, June the 16th, 1934, a train carrying a visiting head of state arrived at Ankara train station. It was a big red carpet occasion. Atatürk and his entire cabinet were there. The visitor was Reza Shah, the ruler of Iran. It was the first time he was traveling outside his country. On the evening of June the 16th, a reception was given in his honor at Çankaya, the presidential residence. The next day, on June the 17th, Atatürk had a surprise for Reza Shah. The two heads of state attended Saygun's opera, Özsoy. This was an eye-opener for Reza Shah, as in, not only could the Turks obviously produce an opera, but they had also a musician who could compose it. Extending his visit by 2 weeks, Reza Shah stayed almost a month in Turkey. There's an interesting account of the effect Kemal Atatürk had on Reza Shah in an excellent book by Stefani Kronin, Making of a Modern State in Iran under Reza Shah. When he got back, Reza Shah embarked on a most radical reform program in Iran. Women were forbidden to wear hijab, the Islamic headgear. For the first time, they were allowed and encouraged to go to university. Kroning writes, Reza Shah's involvement in women's rights intensified enormously after his visit to Turkey and following his discussions with Atatürk. Also, Reza Shah started setting an example by allowing his wife and daughters to appear in public without a hijab, the Islamic headgear. 3/4 of a century later, when he visits Turkey, the president of Iran prefers to avoid Ankara, where Atatürk's mausoleum stands, and flies directly to Istanbul for working visits. After Atatürk died, subsequent opera productions included Beethoven's Fidelio, and the next season, Madame Butterfly, which was staged in full. It was followed by Smetana's Bartered Bride, Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, Puccini's La Bohème, Verdi's Un ballo in maschera, and Bizet's Carmen. This last one calls for another direction. At his premiere at the Opéra Comique in Paris, Carmen was booed. It was due to the character of Carmen herself. She was totally in love with her own liberty, and as such, she changed lovers at a hat's drop. The plot of Carmen hammers this point in time and time again. First with the habanera, and then, at the very end, with her defiance of her former lover. She'd rather be killed by him than give up her new lover, Escamillo, the toreador. Whereas Carmen had shocked the French audiences at the Opéra Comique in Paris, in ATATURK's young Turkish Republic, nobody lifted an eyebrow at the story of a woman who was only fidèle à l'amour, faithful to love. Turkish women had already come a long way from the clutches of Islam. Today, Turkey has 5 opera houses. In Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, Adana, and Mersin, plus a summer season in Aspendos, the open-air Greek amphitheatre. Their repertoire is as varied as those of La Scala, Covent Garden, or the Met. Turks even produced a diva, Leyla Gencer, who in the 60s and 70s shot to fame around the world, singing in Scala, Covent Garden, Berlin, and San Francisco. Professor Arnold Weizmann, in his book, Turkey's Modernization, Refugees from Nazism and Atatürk's Vision, writes, so man's inhumanity to man in one country brought about great developments in leaps and bounds in another, in more humane settings of Kemal Atatürk's Turkey. It is fair to mention that obviously life is not all about opera. In all, there were some 200 Jewish scientists, doctors, economists, jurists, architects, and they're all at the top of their particular tree, and all on the run from Hitler's Germany. This was a story which one could almost call Atatürk's list. What happened to our lot? Ernst Pretorius, Paul Hindemith, and Karl Ebert. Pretorius, probably not wanting to go back to a city where he once drove a cab for 2 years, stayed on in Ankara until he died in 1946. Paul Hindemith went back, became the chief conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic, and composed some of the greatest pieces of 20th century. Karl Ebert is a special case. Before arriving in Turkey, he had come to England. There, an eccentric English aristocrat offered him a project not dissimilar to Atatürk's, to create an opera house from scratch. The company is now called the Glyndebourne Opera. While spending 4 months of the year there, Ebert commuted to Ankara over 10 years. Glyndebourne too became a hugely successful opera company. Later, another Ebert, Peter, Karl's son, arrived there. Taking over from his father, he too directed many successful productions at Glyndebourne. And it was Peter Ebert who kindly shared with me all the first-hand reminiscences of his father and his time in Ankara with ATATURK. With your permission, I would now like to ask Peter to come up and say a few words. I thank you for your attention. Peter, with the permission of the ATATURK Society, we would like to also present in the name of the ATATURK Society of UK a small book about Leyla Gencer, the Turkish soprano, with whom also Peter worked in Glyndebourne. And in the name of our ATATURK Society, I would like you to have this.
What is there to say after these riches that we have had tonight? I am terribly grateful to ATATURK for what he has done, not only for Turkey, but for our family. And it'll be interesting for you to know that my younger siblings who went to school in Ankara count and multiply and divide to this day in Turkish. They are now in pensionable age, so that's quite good. Unfortunately, my wife and I have not got much experience of Turkey. We've had a few wonderful days in Istanbul and on a cruise along the western coast of Turkey. But the importance of ATATURK's invitation to my father to come and create these two academies, of course, was life-giving to the whole family. My father was an innovator, always had been. He had already started two academies in Germany, for which he got the title of professor. And he hadn't even been to the university. And he was an excellent actor, director, and as they call it in Germany, intendant, which is the overall responsibility for the whole apparatus, and a wonderful teacher. We've already heard the story of the young singer who auditioned for a course in the new academy, which was, of course, quite a revelation to him, because how is it possible that somebody cannot hear a scale? And the other funny little incident was that he had a wonderful group of young students as actors. And they were rehearsing a very romantic, I can't remember what it was, and very, very, very strong-minded piece, which included the threat, or perhaps the actual fact, of a lover rushing to the window to jump out and run away. And it came to this scene, and the young man rehearsing this particular role rushed to the window and jumped out. But it was on the first floor. So everybody was horrified. A few seconds later, a radiant student came back, storming back into the room, and thought he'd really beaten it all. My father was obliged to reprimand him gently. It is not part of acting, inevitably, to do the action for real in full. In any case, I do hope that these amazing things that ATATURK has started all these years ago, and which are flourishing now, should go on to build and flourish for all time. Thank you.